Before I tell you what year we will be going to and what country we will be visiting in today's case, I first want to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Cash Frenzy Casino Slots. If you haven't heard of Cash Frenzy, it's an incredible Vegas-style mobile slots game that will give you an authentic casino experience, and you can play at any time and anywhere. So make sure to download it from the QR code here or the link in the description. It has over 300 free-to-play slots on your phone, all with different gameplay, and it's great fun hitting jackpots. I love playing in the evenings after work, and it doesn't take long for me to get a jackpot. Just the other day, I got lucky and won over 88 trillion coins. As you can tell from my experience, Cash Frenzy has incredibly high payouts and great odds, so there's no need to purchase lots of virtual coins in-game to get a sweet jackpot. There are also lots of fun mini-games. My favourite is Coin Mania, a nostalgic coin pusher game. As you can see, the slots have great designs, and one I really enjoy is Cash Coop, because I always win big, and there are great bonuses. Right now, the Independence Day limited time Freedom Cruise is going on. You can collect dices in any slots you love, so join in and claim up to $200 worth of rewards in Pass. Make sure you use the link in the description box or in the pinned comments or the QR code on screen to download Cash Frenzy. It's a great way to pass the time, and it's so easy to get started. And thank you Cash Frenzy once again for supporting the channel and sponsoring this video. Now let's go to late 19th century USA. Elizabeth Atherton was born on the 21st of December 1846 in Manchester in England. She was the daughter of Michael Atherton, an engineer, and Jane Bradshaw, a hard-working woman who did her best to provide a modest income for her family. At the time, Manchester was a bustling hub of the Industrial Revolution, characterised by rapid growth in textile manufacturing. The city was marked by crowded living conditions, frequent economic hardships, and a stark divide between the wealthy and the working classes. Education for poorer children in Britain was minimal, typically limited to basic literacy and numeracy skills, acquired at charity schools or through informal learning at home. Like many children in the 1850s, as soon as Elizabeth was old enough, she entered the workforce to help support her family. In her teens, she married Josiah Potts, and soon after she gave birth to a daughter, who they named Alice May. However, Josiah, lured by the promise of better economic prospects in America, steady work, and a more prosperous life, decided to emigrate. Along with his wife and daughter, he boarded the steamship SS City of Cork, which sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, arriving in New York on the 16th of May 1864. At first, they settled in Wisconsin, where over the next few years, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 more children. However, life in the USA was not as easy as Josiah Potts had imagined. Although the years immediately following the Civil War were marked by rapid industrialization and expansion, the 1870s were more difficult, notably the Panic of 1873, which triggered a severe economic depression that lasted for several years. The financial crisis led to widespread bank failures and a slump in construction and production. Although things improved towards the end of the decade, bolstered by continued innovation and westward expansion, which opened new markets and resources. Josiah was a skilled machinist, and due to his previous experience in the factories in Manchester, he secured a position with the Central Pacific Railroad. However, this meant that the family had to move and relocate. They initially settled in Terrace in Utah, before moving to Carlin in Nevada in 1886. Although the couple had 8 children, by this time, most of them had already started to work, or been placed in service for different families in various states. Living with them in Carlin were 2 of their children, 15-year-old Charles and 5-year-old Edith. Josiah worked hard to provide for his family. He was very well liked by the local community, and described as a kind and dependable man. His wife, however, had a reputation for being difficult. She was often irritable and demanding, and her temper was quick to flare. Many found her hard to get along with, as she was frequently outspoken and critical. Despite her abrasive nature, those who knew her well understood that she had a strong will and a fierce determination. Some surmised that her tough exterior was sometimes necessary to shield against the hardships they faced. In the mid-1880s, Elizabeth went on a trip to San Francisco, where for some reason she decided to amuse herself by trying to find a husband through a matrimonial agency. She was introduced to a man named Miles Fawcett. He had also come to the USA from Manchester and worked as a carpenter. Mr. Fawcett became infatuated with Elizabeth. He gave her gifts and soon proposed. She accepted and unwittingly entered into a bigamous marriage. Soon after, however, Mr. Fawcett discovered his bride was already married and had a husband who lived in Carlin in Nevada. Now feeling remorseful, Elizabeth told him that she was going to return to Carlin to be with her husband and her children. Not wanting to lose his bride, Mr. Fawcett accompanied her, and Elizabeth invited him to lodge in their house in order to help ease their financial worries. Neither she nor Mr. Fawcett disclosed the nature of their relationship or their bigamous marriage to Mr. Potts. This arrangement carried on for some months until Mr. Fawcett purchased a ranch a few miles outside Carlin. Despite this, he frequently visited Mrs. Potts, who would often cook for him and wash his laundry. This strange situation did cause a few whispers among the neighbours, many of who wondered why Mrs. Potts maintained such a close relationship with Mr. Fawcett while still living with her husband. On the 1st of January 1888, Mr. Fawcett travelled into Carlin from his ranch that was a few miles outside of town. He met up with a friend named Mr. J.P. Linebarger, and together they went to visit Mr. and Mrs. Potts. As they made their way to the Potts' small house, Mr. Fawcett confided in Mr. Linebarger that the couple owed him money. He explained that when he lived with them, they had struggled to pay their rent, so he helped them out. He also mentioned that Mrs. Elizabeth Potts was keen to settle the debt to prevent her husband Josiah from discovering her activities while she was in California. The afternoon passed pleasantly, but as evening approached, it began to rain and darkness set in, so Mrs. Potts invited Mr. Fawcett to spend the night. She advised him not to try and return to his ranch at such a late hour. He accepted her offer, and shortly after, Mr. Linebarger bid farewell and made his way home. 2 weeks later, people began to notice the mysterious absence of Mr. Miles Fawcett. Despite some initial suspicion, the transient nature of Carlin, a town where many came and went, meant that people often lived there for a while, then suddenly left, often without telling anyone where they were going. Nonetheless, Mr. Linebarger approached the Potts family to inquire about his friend's whereabouts. They explained that a disagreement had occurred after Mr. Fawcett had attempted to assault their daughter. They said that when he realised the seriousness of his actions, he decided to head east and sold them his property. Mrs. Potts then produced a bill of sale. Unconvinced by their story, Mr. Linebarger reported the matter to Deputy Sheriff McIntosh. The deputy visited Mr. Fawcett's ranch. When he arrived there, he found the door open and all valuable items gone. While some of his belongings were at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Potts, there was no evidence that anything untoward had happened, so the brief investigation was closed. A few months later, in the summer of 1888, Mr. and Mrs. Potts, along with their 2 children, moved to Rock Springs in Wyoming. They confided to their neighbours about their hopes for a fresh start in a new town. The house they vacated was then rented to Mr. George and Mrs. Amelia Brewer. Mrs. Brewer was someone who professed to have a heightened sensitivity to spiritual phenomena, and while in the house vacated by Mr. and Mrs. Potts, she began reporting sightings of apparitions and hearing eerie sounds, especially in the cellar. So convinced was she by these experiences that she wrote about them in the Elko Free Press. Her article, published on the 5th of January 1889, claimed that the ghost in her house was more active in the cellar, where it frequently knocked over jars of pickles and generally caused a nuisance. Somewhat intrigued, Mrs. Brewer's husband George decided to go into the cellar to see if there was in fact anything causing these strange occurrences. He took with him an iron rod, which he poked into the floor. Some of the ground was soft, and he surmised that it may have been previously dug up. However, he found nothing suspicious, so after a while gave up on his quest. However, the strange noises continued, so a week later, he went back to the cellar and once again started digging around. After a while, he came across something quite disturbing. At first, he thought it was a rotten turnip, but as he pulled at it, he realised there was hair, and the smell became quite unbearable. He immediately contacted Deputy George McIntosh, who in turn alerted Sheriff Barnard in Elko. Sheriff Barnard dispatched officers to investigate exactly what or who was beneath the cellar floor. What they found was quite gruesome. The remains of a man who had been brutally dismembered. The skull was charred and partially crushed and bore the marks of a violent end. The features, however, had been obliterated by fire and time. Although formal identification was not possible, there was a knife found in the man's trouser pockets. This was later confirmed to have once belonged to Mr. Miles Fawcett, who had last been seen 12 months previously in the house where the body had been discovered. In the knowledge that at that time Mr. Josiah and Mrs. Elizabeth Potts had been living there, Sheriff Barnard and Constable Joe Triplett set off for Wyoming in order to bring them back to Nevada so they could assist the police with their investigations into the death of Mr. Fawcett. During the long journey back to Carlin, Josiah Potts began to talk. The stress and tension of the situation seemed to weigh on him, and eventually he confessed to the grisly details of what happened on that fateful day. Josiah admitted that he had dismembered and buried Mr. Fawcett's body. He explained that Mr. Fawcett had committed suicide in their house, a tragic and shocking event that left him in a state of panic. Fearing that he would be blamed for the death and subsequently charged with murder, Josiah said that he made a desperate decision to get rid of the body. He told officers that he hoped that by disposing of the evidence, he could avoid any legal consequences and protect his family from scandal and suspicion. As Josiah recounted the events, Sheriff Barnard and Constable Triplett listened intensely, taking note of every detail. But both men wondered if this was actually a true version of what had happened. Josiah and Elizabeth Potts were then charged with murder and placed in jail to await their trial. On the 12th of March 1889, the trial began in front of Judge R.R. Bigelow. There was a great sense of anticipation. The courtroom was filled with an air of tension and curiosity. The mood was charged with expectation, with every eye fixed on the proceedings, waiting to see how the case would unfold and what revelations would come to light. The prosecution's case began with Mr. Linebarger taking the stand as their first witness. He recounted the events leading up to Miles Fawcett's tragic end, recalling how he, along with the deceased man, had visited Mr. and Mrs. Potts' residence on the 1st of January 1888. According to Mr. Linebarger, Mrs. Potts had convinced Mr. Fawcett to stay overnight. It was dark and cold, and Mr. Fawcett decided to accept her offer of hospitality. When asked why he and Mr. Fawcett had gone to the Potts' residence on that particular day, Mr. Linebarger replied that the Potts were in debt to Mr. Fawcett and he wanted to collect the payment. The courtroom fell silent, however, when Mr. Linebarger disclosed that earlier that day he had seen Mr. Fawcett's purse, which contained a substantial amount of gold and money. Next to testify were the Brewers, who recounted the eerie occurrences in their home and detailed the unsettling discovery of a partially burned and dismembered body in their cellar. They shared the chilling sequence of events leading up to the grim find, painting a vivid picture of shock and disbelief that gripped their household. Deputy McIntosh followed, recounting his investigation at the deceased man's ranch. He told the court that there had been no signs of a disturbance, but many items had been removed from the property. District Attorney Love, who was representing the prosecution, skillfully wove these testimonies together. He presented a compelling case against Josiah and Elizabeth Potts in less than 2 days. The evidence he had assembled clearly indicated a motive and an opportunity for the defendants to have committed this most horrible crime. Mr. and Mrs. Potts' teenage son Charlie took the stand as the first witness for the defence. He recounted hearing Ray's voices on the evening of the 1st of January. He said that he got out of bed to investigate. According to Charlie, he opened the kitchen door just as Miles Fawcett shot himself. Disturbed by what he had witnessed, he said that he then went back to bed and insisted that what had happened that evening was never discussed within the family thereafter. When asked if his parents had instructed him to say this in court, he replied that they had not. Elizabeth Potts was the next witness. She was calm as she explained that Miles Fawcett had come to their home to collect his laundry. As it was New Year's Day, she invited both Mr. Fawcett and Mr. Linebarger inside for a glass of whiskey. She said they all spoke for a while, and after a couple of drinks, Mr. Linebarger departed. But it was what she said next that stunned the courtroom. She looked at the judge, her voice unsteady, yet resolute. She told of how her husband had been searching in her trunk for a postage stamp, but as he rummaged through her belongings, he unexpectedly found an unsent letter that was addressed to Deputy Mackintosh, and that she had written a year or so before. He opened it and began to read it. This letter, however, contained a disturbing account from the summer of 1886, which involved Miles Fawcett, who was living in their barn at the time. Elizabeth said that she had written about a day that began with panic when she noticed that her young daughter Edith was missing. She described her frantic search, calling out for Edith and scouring every corner of their home and property. With growing desperation, she finally decided to check the barn and asked Mr. Fawcett if he had seen her daughter. Once there, she saw Edith. She had been taken against her will. Overcome with a mix of emotions, she said that she shouted at Mr. Fawcett, calling him an old wrench and threatening him with severe punishment. As she recounted the incident, her voice started to tremble. She then turned to the jury and described how Mr. Fawcett had reacted very violently. She said he grabbed her, began to choke her, and threatened to kill her if she ever spoke of the incident. She went on to say that she lived in fear of Mr. Fawcett, and due to this continued to occasionally cook for him and do his laundry, never again mentioning what had happened. However, from that day, she never let young Edith out of her sight, and was always very vigilant in order to protect her daughter. Mrs. Potts said that when her husband found the letter, he confronted Mr. Fawcett and threatened to lynch him. In a desperate attempt to save himself, Mr. Fawcett offered to give the Potts everything he owned and promised to leave Carlin. Elizabeth drafted a bill of sale, which Mr. Fawcett signed, but her husband Josiah threw it down, declaring that he did not want Mr. Fawcett's money or property. As the courtroom remained silent, Elizabeth maintained a calm but serious tone, while she described the shocking climax of the confrontation. She said that Mr. Fawcett grabbed a revolver from the shelf, held it on the left side of his head, and said, "You folks will be blamed for this." He then pulled the trigger. Elizabeth went on to say that she looked at her husband in disbelief, but he told her to go to bed, assuring her that he would sort everything out. When Josiah took the stand, he confirmed his wife's account and described how when alone with Mr. Fawcett's lifeless body, he wrestled with the fear of being blamed for his death, so made the decision to conceal it. He said that he carefully wrapped the deceased man in blankets and then carried the body to the cellar, placing it in a shallow grave. Josiah went on to say that as months passed, he became anxious that the body may be discovered, so he dug it up and attempted to dispose of it. He briefly looked at the floor before saying that in desperation, he began to cut the body into pieces. First, he removed the head and feet and crushed the skull. He had planned to burn it, but as the body parts began to smell, he stopped and reburied them instead. He stressed that his wife had nothing to do with the handling of the body and said that they took no personal belongings or money from the deceased. When the trial ended, the judge summed up the case and the jury was sent out to deliberate. They did so for 4 hours before returning to find both the accused guilty of murder. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a heavy silence as the weight of the verdict settled in. The judge then sentenced Josiah Potts and his wife Elizabeth to death. The sentence and verdict were appealed to the Supreme Court, which granted a stay of execution. However, after their review, the original sentence and verdict were upheld. Still convinced that the Potts were innocent, 267 Carlin residents signed a petition and presented it to the Board of Pardons. Even Judge Bigelow, who had handed down the original death sentence, and Deputy Sheriff Dowley made an appeal to try and get the sentence overturned. However, all of these appeals were denied. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Potts remained in Elko jail. The agonising wait for the execution became unbearable for Elizabeth. It slowly eroded her composure, and each passing moment seemed to stretch into an eternity as the weight of her impending doom pressed heavily upon her. This increased as a gallows for the hanging were built behind the Elko courthouse, and during their construction, all the noise could be heard from her cell. Quite desperate, she somehow managed to conceal a small knife on her person, and as her state of despair continued, she tried to take her own life, but she was quickly spotted by a guard, and her attempt was unsuccessful. At 10:30 a.m. on Friday the 20th of June 1890, officers gave the condemned couple a drink. Before Reverend Porter said a prayer, Mrs. Potts raised her hand and declared their innocence as the death warrants were read. 52 witnesses were present, all of whom were men, as no women were permitted to attend. After another drink, they calmly walked to the gallows. Elizabeth wore a white dress with black bows, and Josiah was dressed in a suit. They were bound, shoeless, and shared a final kiss before black hoods and nooses were placed over them. In a soft voice, Josiah repeatedly said, "Lord, have mercy on me," while Elizabeth pleaded, "Lord, have mercy on my soul." The trap door was then opened, and Mr. Josiah and Mrs. Elizabeth Potts were hanged. They were laid to rest side by side in Potter's Field, not far from the grave of Miles Fawcett, the man who they had been convicted of killing. After the hanging, their son Charles moved away, while their young daughter Edith was adopted by a local couple. It is reported that Edith later confided that she had seen her mother shoot Miles Fawcett while her father was out. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case